All right, welcome back to a special edition of Around the SEC. I'm here with Jake Crain. We're going to talk a little SEC football today. Coming up on the season, who says May's too early to talk SEC football? Nobody. That's who. Jake, how you doing, man?
Man, I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me on. Excited to talk a little ball and look forward to what hopefully is a really exciting season this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just jump right in. I have questions about Alabama. Not that they're going to win the West, but replacing a quarterback, a running back, two wide receivers, including the Heisman Trophy winner, a mess around on the offensive line, and bringing in an offensive coordinator that traded away DeAndre Hopkins. I have concerns, man.
And listen, logically those are valid points. I just look at what Nick Saban's built there, the early enrollees they brought on this offensive line class. It's as good as it gets. Now, it may take them a little bit to get their feet wet on offense. I think defensively they're going to be a whole heck of a lot better than they were last year. People don't realize going into last year, they lost like 85% of their pass rush. They got guys like Will Anderson back. You look across that defensive line. Offensively, with Bill O'Brien and Bryce Young, I think that's a very interesting fit. I wonder how much they're going to use Bryce Young's legs. I think they lose an SEC game this year, but I think they do win the West. And Alabama, the reason Nick Saban has so much success outside of being an unbelievable recruiter is he's an unbelievable structurer of the roster. They never tend to lose too much at too many important spots, and they always have great players. They develop talent. You don't see a ton of guys leaving there. So while they won't be nearly as dynamic as they were last year, they're unbelievably talented, and they're adding in the portal. Henry To'oTo'o from Tennessee is huge for that defense. Jack Martin's the best punter in the country. So Alabama, they're going to be right there.
Yeah, and I do have concerns about Bryce Young, not because of talent, because he's a little slight guy. And last year, in years past, Tua played the whole fourth quarter and part of the third quarter. Mac Jones played the whole fourth quarter and part of the third quarter. You hardly saw Bryce Young last year. He's going to be fine. He's going to be talented, but there's probably going to be some growing pains.
Oh, yeah, there is. Especially when a young guy is actually the guy. And there were people last year that actually thought Bryce Young was going to give Mac Jones a run for his money. And people have to remember, Mac Jones was a heck of a player. He's also surrounded by some really good players. Had probably the best offensive line, if not one of the best, if not the best offensive lines. You look at that receiving core, even losing Jalen Waddle with what he had, they always had an answer. And they're returning some guys I really like Latu at the tight end. But you bring up a great point. I think that they have to balance how much Bryce Young runs. This guy isn't built like Cam Newton. He's not built like Joe Burrow. He's not one of these bigger guys. He's really witchy, as I call it. He can get himself out of trouble, extend the play. The question is, if you're Bill O'Brien, how much is Bryce Young going to understand? Listen, there's no problem with tucking it and getting three and not trying to put your head down or extend the run to make it 2nd and 5 instead of 2nd and 7 because you can't run him to death. He won't make it through the whole season. Then you go back to, all right, well, will there be any zone read stuff? Are they going to let Bryce really be himself or tone it down? Because I don't know if he's a guy, especially early, that is going to sit in the pocket and tear you apart.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me a little bit. Actually, I'm going to date myself a little bit of Dexter McCluster at Ole Miss. He was elite at positioning his body not to take a direct hit. That's the reason he was so durable, even though he was 5'8", 170 pounds, playing running back in the SEC. There's a little bit of Bryce Young, and he has to come to grips and terms with that to run the ball in this league.
Now I think he's a great athlete. I don't think he's as athletic as Nick Marshall, but it's kind of that line that Auburn had to walk with Nick Marshall, who's a guy who ran the ball a lot, but was able to avoid contact. He knew when to get out, knew when to say when. That's why he was able to make it through the whole year, and that's a recipe I think you'll see Alabama use. My question is, with the backups behind him, if something were to happen to Bryce Young, Paul Tyson's a totally different quarterback than Bryce Young is. So how does that affect your offense? How does that affect your play calling? It's going to be interesting to see how Bill O'Brien handles that.
And I'm a huge Brian Robinson fan. I'm looking forward to seeing him as the guy. And there's a chance for them to be dynamic, but Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss come into Tuscaloosa week 4. There's a chance to get them.
Well, Lane's so good offensively, and he's one of the guys that Nick Saban will tell you he's a problem because he's been at places with Nick Saban. He knows what those defensive guys are looking for. He knows the adjustments. He's got really good feel as a play caller in him. And listen, Lane gets a lot of credit, but I like Jeff Levy as well a lot too, the OC there. Those two have great rapport. I think that between Matt Corral, Lane Kiffin, and Jeff Levy, that's the best relationship and chemistry there is between a quarterback, a head coach, and offensive coordinator. But the question is, can they stop anybody? I know they've added some personnel on defense. They didn't have anything last year. But one of the most glaring stats of last year is that if Ole Miss didn't even put a defense out there against Alabama, they'd only given up 20 more yards. So you got to be able to stop them because we know Lane's going to score. And if they're able to, it can be a heck of a game. Hugh Freeze did it with Bo Wallace.
Yeah, and last year defensively was kind of an aberration because you had no spring, a shortened fall, and all the COVID stuff coming in, and Alabama coming in week 3, Florida week 1. There was going to be a problem at the beginning of last season. They bounced out of it pretty well with the top 10 win in the Outback Bowl. But let's move on to Florida. Speaking of which, Emory Jones. I think the biggest trap that Dan Mullen has to deal with is the success of Kyle Trask. Emory Jones is not that type of quarterback. If he tries to force the Kyle Trask system on him, it could go wrong.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Emory Jones is really more of the type quarterback that Dan Mullen's used to. If you kind of go back through that he's used to operating with. You talk about losing a lot at Alabama. Look at what Florida lost offensively. I mean, you lose Pitts. You lose Kadarius Toney. You lose Grimes. You lose Kyle Trask. They're having to replace some guys offensive line. I don't think Emory Jones can throw them to wins. I got Florida actually taking a step back. I think Dan Mullen is on his way out of college football into the NFL. He's just looking for the first time to hit that eject button and get out of the plane.
Yeah, it kind of feels that way as well. Let's move off the road to Athens. And one thing that I hit Corey Burton, who's on your network from time to time, he comes on the show, is will Kirby Smart take his thumb off the offense enough for them to be successful? Will he be okay giving up 24 points instead of 14?
Yeah, I think they get over the hump this year. I got Daniels and Todd Monken. And if you look, it's kind of funny. Kirby Smart worked for Nick Saban for a while. He has that blueprint. There was that old mindset of thinking we're going to run the ball, play action pass, play great defense, win the field position battle, not turn the ball over, and we're just going to be better than you. And for a while in college football, you go back to the LSU, the 9-6 games, and when Bama was beating people 24-3 and 20-0. And not giving up any points. That's not the way the game is nowadays. And Nick Saban evolved from that. Speaking of Lane Kiffin, decided, hey, we got to score points to win. And he started to trust the OC and the quarterback a little bit more as it went down the road. And I think you're seeing Kirby Smart this year with Todd Monken and JT Daniels. I know they lost Pickens, but they've recruited really well. You look at Blaylock, you look at Burton, you go down the list of the athletes. Darnell Washington is an absolute monster at tight end at 6'7", 280, what is it? And he's built like a Greek god. But physically, that Georgia team is different as well. But no, I think they're going to open it up. I think you're going to see Georgia take shots early, which keeps the defense honest. No more will it be, hey, we're going to load the box against Georgia, try and stop the run and let them throw to beat us. Now you have to defend every blade of grass. And when you have those type athletes, you're going to score a lot of points. And that's the difference right now between Georgia getting over that hump. Because don't forget, Georgia's led at halftime against Alabama, I believe, the last 3 games and hadn't been able to finish it. What does that mean? They're losing the battle of adjustments. When you're more balanced on offense, it's harder to make those adjustments, therefore letting you score more points throughout the course of the game as opposed to when you're on script early.
All right. Let's go across to the SEC West a little bit. Texas A&M. Kellen Mond gone. They are improved talent-wise all over the field, but it's down to a new quarterback. What are you hearing over there?
Well, it's been between, freshman phenom Haynes King or the young guy, I believe he may be a sophomore now, and Calzada, who's actually from the Atlanta area here in Georgia. And they're 2 different quarterbacks. And I'll say this, I thought Kellen Mond was a great college quarterback, but I don't think Jimbo trusted him late in games to throw the ball, and they didn't have to with that offensive line. If you watch, you go back, there were times where they said, listen, we're just going to be a python and squeeze you to death in the fourth quarter, and they were good enough up front to do it. I actually think you bring in a guy like Haynes King, if he's the starter, you open that offense up a little bit more. They could be even more dangerous offensively. They return Spiller. Damian Craig's one of the best wide receiver coaches in the league. What he was able to do with that group last year with the opt-outs and the injuries to still be able to put up the numbers they did was impressive. But I think Jimbo, the offense may be better. Now, Calzada's more of a pro-style guy. He's more experienced. Kind of fits more of who Jimbo is. But Jimbo's been smart enough to be able to adjust. But the biggest difference for Texas A&M is defensively. Typically, Texas A&M hasn't had a problem scoring on offense. You go back to the Johnny Manziel, Mike Evans, go down the list, Kyle Allen, all that stuff. They've had trouble stopping people. Last year, they lead the SEC in defense. They finished with a top 5 recruiting class. They are hell up front on the defensive line. I love Edgerrin Cooper at linebacker. You look at Jalen Jones out at corner, the guys that are returning. I love A&M. Do they have enough right now to usurp Alabama? I don't think so, but Jimbo is really starting to build something in College Station. And if people don't watch out, Texas A&M is going to start rolling even more than just once every 2 or 3 years because Jimbo's built it from the inside out. That's the only way you can compete against teams like Alabama and Georgia in this league.
All right, and full disclosure coming up. I served on staff with Ed Orgeron at Ole Miss. I was at Rivals for 10 years, so there's a little bit of history going on with what I'm about to say. I saw a top coaching list that you put out on Twitter today.
Oh yeah, brace for impact.
Yes. And how is Coach O different than Larry Coker?
Here's the way I look at it, and listen, winning a national championship is obviously the epitome, and that has to be taken into account. But where would you, I tell the people that complain, where would you put Gene Chizik on that list, who won a national championship, went undefeated, then got fired 2 years later? And you've seen that happen multiple times. You bring up Larry Coker, and I think Ed Orgeron's a good coach. I think he is. But I think if you put Lane Kiffin at LSU, they're a real problem consistently. Because, again, you can run into personnel that helps you. You could have had this Sprite bottle right here, Coach Cam Newton at Auburn, offensively, and they'd score 40 points a game. That's how good he was. Now, I think Ed Orgeron is an unbelievable coach and a great motivator. And the craziest part, I've got LSU finishing second in the West this year, tied record-wise for Texas A&M and beating them the last game at home. But I don't think Ed Orgeron is in the category of a Kirby Smart, of a Nick Saban, of a Jimbo Fisher, and being at LSU, you can win with the resources and the talent. You're the state school. You're going to dominate that state. And then you hit the lottery with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and some of these other guys. I want to see if he can sustain it. 2-3 years down the road, if they're having sustained success, I'll be the first one to come on here and say I was wrong. But I don't see it.
All right, let's go up to Starkville. The drop 8 kryptonite for Mike Leach. He find a cure this year?
I think they're person. I've had Mike Leach on the show. I like Mike. And what he did at Washington State and Texas Tech was awesome. But that's in the Big 12 and the Pac-12. This is the SEC. You look at the LSU game last year, they torched LSU because LSU wouldn't get out of man. It's amazing the teams that started playing zone against them, how much more success they had. And it's one thing to do it in the Pac-12. But if you cannot run the ball in the SEC, the smoke draw, you're not going to smoke draw your way to the SEC championship. You're just not going to do it. And the air raid, his system, it's really, really hit or miss. But I think the athletes in this league being paired up with where you're at in Starkville, with what Lane's doing at Ole Miss, I just see it as an uphill battle, and I don't think Mississippi State's going to be a factor.
All right, let's head up to Oxford, Ole Miss, and Lane Kiffin in year 2. We talked about Matt Corral a little bit. We talked about Jeff Lebby a little bit. And how do you see it going this year in Oxford?
They're building. They're building. I think they're going to beat one, maybe 2 teams they're not supposed to beat. I really like their person. I know they lost Elijah Moore, but I like Aboa. I love Braylon Sanders. I love that connection that they have even in the spring. But Matt Corral, when I drop my top quarterbacks, he's going to be up there very, very high. I think he's got unbelievable feel, not only in the pocket, but outside the pocket. I already talked about the rapport with Lane and Jeff Lebby. I know the one kind of caveat is the offensive line. With the coach being let go, it's kind of a weird time. They've got to shore that up. That's the engine that makes the whole thing go. But I believe in Lane. So I see a good year. I see him finishing anywhere between 3 and 4 in the West and beating somebody they shouldn't and building. I think even when they do lose Corral, Lane Kiffin is so good with quarterbacks, him and Lebby, and they get that defense built up. Ole Miss is going to be a formidable problem. No longer is it going to be a cakewalk when you play Ole Miss.
Okay, and just another, some of these lists that come out, especially after the draft, there's some of them that just omitted Matt Corral completely. They do a top 10 list without Matt Corral. What do you think's happening there?
I think a lot of people don't do their research. I think a lot of people look at other lists, and it tends to be contagious. But, if you don't have Matt Corral in your top 10 quarterbacks in college football, what are we talking about? If we're talking about production, he has to be on there. You know how much they're going to throw the ball. You know how good Lane is and Jeff are schematically. The way they use the back out of the backfield, something that Lane does really well. You look at Jerry and Ely, a guy that I think is going to have a super year. He's going to get a lot of touches in the passing game, not a ton compared to other guys in the run game. But listen, these preseason lists, a lot of them are hot takes trying to generate content in the offseason. But I think if you omit him, I'm seeing some lists where JT Daniels isn't in there. So I I don't understand it. And again, I think there is some bias against the SEC when it comes down to it from some outside forces. But listen, preseason lists are preseason lists, and we're going to see.
All right, and before I let you out of here, I'm going to ask you a simple question. Which do you prefer, Ronnie Brown or Cadillac Williams?
Oh, you got to give me Caddy. I'm getting Caddy all day.
Okay. All right. Jake Crain coming in from the J Boys Show. You can catch him on the Believe Network. Pimp your website real quick.
It's thejboyshow.com. We got great merchandise over there. You can subscribe. We got a YouTube channel. It's the J Boy Show, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We're at the J Boy Show on Instagram and Twitter. I mean, we have big time guests all the time. We've had Mike Leach, Shane Beamer, Bruce Pearl, Mike Farrell, National Director of Recruiting. We cover a lot of recruiting in the SEC as well. And no politics. We talk ball. So if you're looking for a place to kind of get behind the helmet, or as we say, win the water cooler, come check us out. Just dropped some with Cole Kubelik, Rick and Bubba from the Rick and Bubba Show. Got Barstool Mincy coming on tomorrow. Ross Dellinger from Sports Illustrated talking some SEC. So we're always chopping it up, talking ball, and I really appreciate it, brother. You do a great job.
Thank you a whole bunch, and let's do it again.
For sure. Let me know.